in the context before and after, they're talking about the gospel. So, I mean, what else do they talk about? Paul said, I preach nothing but Christ and him crucified, but that is the context in Galatians 1, both before that comment and beginning in Galatians 2. So he's there with Peter and James, and then he comes back in Galatians chapter 2. He makes a second trip to Jerusalem, and I think 2:2, Galatians 2:2 is one of the most incredible verses in the entire New Testament. I set before them the gospel that I was preaching to see if I was running in vain. Now, vain, I mean, check out 1 Corinthians 15 on what vain is. And he's going to subject his gospel to James, Peter, and now John is there. The biggest foursome in the early church, the most influential writers, check Tabor, the most influential men in the early church, they're there together. And Galatians 2:6, they added nothing to me. Galatians 2, 9 and 10, where we get our little phrase, they gave us the right hand of fellowship. Now, if we can trust Paul, and Paul's the darling of critical scholarship, Paul lays before them the gospel, they added nothing to me, and they confirmed our message. Who? James, Peter, and John. Wait a minute. I thought we had a divergent tradition here. The James tradition, the Paul tradition. That runs roughshod over Galatians 1 and Galatians 2, unanimously ascribed to Paul at about 50 AD, perhaps. One more thing. If he gets this in 50 AD, 35 AD, that's simply when Paul received the material. If he got it from James and Peter, they had it before him. So you have Garrett Ludeman saying that this material dates from perhaps 3 years after the cross. You have the Jesus Seminar in their Acts of Jesus book saying by their vote that this Pauline material probably preceded Paul's conversion. So now you have it in that little tiny opening between the cross and Paul. And of late, one of the most influential, if not the most influential theologian right now, James D.G. Dunn, said in his recent book, Remembering Jesus, that this passage, 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following, wasn't just taught, it was already stratified. It was already put into this creedal form within months of the crucifixion, says Dunn. Now, we know Jesus dies in the spring. Within months, this is a 30 AD report, according to James Dunn. If you're going to talk about second century things, talk about second century things. But I want to know how we're going to beat 30 to 35 AD.
Yeah, so now you've got this report that goes right back to Jesus himself. And, I mean, that from 150 years later, for people talking about Jesus, is like us talking about people before Abraham Lincoln, for Pete's sake. That's a long period of time. And to say that the people 150 years after Christ have got the scoop, and Paul and James and Peter do not. And again, these fellows are testifying to what Paul says there. The reason that's a creedal statement is because that language that Paul uses in 1 Corinthians, he doesn't use some of those words in other places. So it's the scholars can see that. Talk to me about that.
Well, that's very important. We look for these kind of embedded nuggets for early tradition that predates the writer, tradition that the writer appeals to because it's common ground. Keep that in mind. Paul has a problem with what some Christians at Corinth are saying about the resurrection. So he appeals to not just common ground, but ground that precedes Paul himself and his theological developments and reflections. And so this is very important pre-Pauline common ground. And he tells the Corinthians, be reminded of this and keep in mind what this is teaching. That I find, I agree with Gary, that is very significant. It's very old, very primitive. And to overthrow that with traditions that developed 100, 150 years later, I find that a very, very dubious way to proceed.
John, if I could just jump in here for a second. I think I don't want to be misunderstood as saying two things here. Not only is this material early an eyewitness. Everyone says, at least for Paul, it's eyewitness. Then we have Paul's comments about 3 other eyewitnesses. So at least we have Paul's comment in them. But the other thing is the Tabor response, that there's 2 early traditions, and James does not agree with Paul. I just want to say, the same material that says this is early says there were not 2 traditions. Now somebody might say, well, wait a minute. Didn't Paul and Peter have an argument? Yes, they did. It's Galatians 2, second half of the same chapter. But it's over a periphery item. It's over fellowship with Gentiles. They do not discuss the sinner. They're in agreement there. They added nothing to me, Galatians 2:6. They gave us the right hand of fellowship, Galatians 2:9 and 10. The earliest leaders are together on this. And to overthrow that is going to be very difficult in light of the authorship of Galatians, Paul being behind it, and Paul being, a rabbinic source, a good thinking mind who gives us his name and place on this. It's a solid line of evidence.
Yeah, Craig, for the non-Christian that is listening to this, what we're saying is, look, if you're a non-Christian, these are solid sources that you've got to deal with. And summarize what the conclusion is when you actually come to this and give it a fair shake.
When you get right down to it, when you boil it down to its simplest terms, Paul himself knew eyewitnesses of Jesus' ministry and resurrection. Paul himself was encountered and changed by the risen Christ. I would take Paul's testimony any day over the fanciful and hypothetical reconstructions of some of these modern writers.
All right, next program, we're going to take that 1 Corinthians 15 passage and let's talk about the eyewitnesses reported they saw Jesus. What does that mean? Was it a vision? Was it actual physical appearance? How do we know what the difference is? And we'll talk about that in our next program.